A millionaire arrives at an isolated restaurant for a business dinner, aiming to resolve some pending matters. As soon as the discussion begins, a little beggar girl bursts into the place running, reaches the millionaire's table and whispers in his ear, "Sir, this man brought a gun." The waiters see the girl and kick her out of the restaurant. She now waits anxiously outside, but 7 minutes later, the beggar girl hears loud gunshot noises coming from inside the restaurant and starts crying desperately. What happens next is completely shocking. The biting December chill sliced through the fine fabric of Edward Monroe's Italian suit as he adjusted the knot on his tie for the third time in 5 minutes. His fingers trembled slightly, not from the weather, but from the tension coiling in his chest like a snake about to strike. At 52, the CEO had faced hostile takeovers, corporate betrayals, and financial crises that had leveled empires. Yet something about tonight felt different, dangerous in a way he couldn't name. The call had come that morning with an unexpected proposal. The man's voice on the other end was polite, almost deferential, identifying himself as a representative of Atlantic Corp, his biggest business rival for the past 8 months. "Mr. Monroe, we believe the time has come to settle our differences. Like gentlemen, how about a civilized dinner to discuss a deal that would benefit both our companies?" Edward ran a hand through his graying hair, recalling how many times he had walked into similar traps throughout his career. His natural suspicion, honed by years of low blows in the corporate world, whispered constant warnings in his mind. However, the monthly losses from the trade war with Atlantic were affecting not only his profits, but also the jobs of hundreds of employees who depended on his company. "Why now?" Edward had asked, leaning his elbow on the mahogany desk in his office. "After months of attacking us in every possible market, you suddenly want to make peace? Let's just say our shareholders are pushing for a more economical resolution to this conflict," the man replied in a tone Edward couldn't quite decipher. "The summit at River's Edge on the west side at 9 tonight. Are you familiar with it?" Edward was. An elegant establishment frequented by the elite, but located in a relatively isolated part of the city. Perfect for discreet conversations and deals best kept away from the prying eyes of the financial press. "I'll be there," he confirmed, hanging up with a strange knot in his stomach. Now, standing before the mirror in his walk-in closet, Edward questioned if he'd made the right call. His intuition, sharpened by decades of navigating treacherous business waters, screamed warnings he was choosing to ignore. Perhaps it was just paranoia, a byproduct of too many betrayals over the years. Or perhaps his survival instinct was trying to protect him from something his rational mind couldn't yet process. He descended the marble steps of his Greenwich mansion, giving a discreet nod to the night security guard before getting into his armored Mercedes. The decision to use the ballistic-proof car had been made years ago, after receiving a few threats from less scrupulous competitors. Tonight, he was grateful for the precaution. During the drive through the city's near-empty streets, Edward let his mind drift to the last few months of the trade war. Atlantic Corp had launched an aggressive campaign to poach his key clients, offering prices that were impossible to compete with and spreading rumors about his company's financial stability. Every move they made felt calculatedly cruel, as if they knew his weak points with surgical precision. The GPS indicated he was just 3 miles from the restaurant when Edward spotted a small figure huddled under the awning of a closed shop. It was the girl he always saw near his midtown office, a homeless child of about 8, with large, expressive eyes that seemed to hold too much wisdom for her age. Without a second thought, he pulled over and lowered the window. "Are you cold?" he asked, extending a few bills through the window. The girl gave a shy smile and a nod, scurrying back to her shelter. Edward drove on, never imagining that this Small interaction was just the first thread in a web that would change their lives forever. The summit at River's Edge appeared ahead, its golden lights creating a welcoming atmosphere that clashed jarringly with the dark premonition growing in Edward's chest. The interior of the summit at River's Edge exuded understated elegance, with tables spaced strategically to ensure privacy for important conversations. Edward handed his keys to the valet, a friendly-looking young man, who greeted him with excessive deference. Everything seemed perfectly normal, yet the feeling of unease persisted like a shadow clinging to his shoulders. The maître d' led him to a reserved table at the back of the room, near the windows that offered a view of the softly lit indoor garden. Edward discreetly scanned the surroundings, noting the restaurant was less busy than usual for a Friday night. Only 3 other tables were occupied, with couples conversing in whispers and a lone man who seemed to be waiting for someone. "You've arrived first, sir," the maître d' commented, adjusting the chair. "Your guest shouldn't be long. May I offer you a drink while you wait?" Edward ordered a whiskey, neat, needing something to calm his increasingly frayed nerves. As he waited, he watched the staff move with quiet efficiency, experienced waiters, an attentive sommelier, an impeccable atmosphere. Everything contributed to the sophisticated ambiance that made this a preferred venue for delicate business. 15 minutes later, an average-looking man approached the table. He was about 40, in a well-tailored navy suit, with an elegant but non-intimidating presence. He extended his hand with a cordial smile, introducing himself as Robert Shaw, an executive representative from Atlantic Corp. "Mr. Monroe, it's a pleasure to meet you in person," Shaw said, shaking Edward's hand with appropriate firmness. "I've heard a great deal about your reputation in the market. Impressive stories about your ability to turn failing companies into profitable empires." Edward returned the courtesy, but remained on high alert. Excessive compliments in the corporate world usually preceded low blows. "Thank you for the kind words. I imagine we're not here just to exchange pleasantries." "Certainly not," Shaw agreed, sitting down and gesturing for the waiter. "Our companies have been wasting considerable resources and energy in this dispute. Our shareholders are beginning to question the wisdom of a conflict that only benefits our smaller competitors." The conversation initially flowed through neutral topics: the market in general, economic trends, regulatory challenges. Edward gradually began to relax, recognizing the type of negotiation he knew well. Shaw demonstrated a solid knowledge of the sector and presented proposals that seemed reasonable, though they obviously favored Atlantic's interests. "I believe we can find a middle ground," Shaw continued, leafing through some documents he had brought in his leather briefcase. "Territorially dividing some markets, setting price floors in certain segments, perhaps even considering strategic partnerships on specific projects." Edward analyzed each proposal carefully, searching for hidden traps in the clauses. His experience had taught him that the real dangers always hid in seemingly insignificant details. However, the proposals seemed genuinely aimed at ending the conflict in a mutually beneficial way. It was then that the evening's tranquility was shattered by a sound that made Edward jump, the patter of hurried footsteps racing across the restaurant floor. He turned to see a small figure darting through the elegant space like a miniature hurricane. It was the same girl he had seen on the street, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and determination. The waiters immediately moved to intercept her, showing clear irritation at the presence of a homeless child in such a refined establishment. "Hey kid, you can't be in here," one of them exclaimed, blocking her path with obvious disdain. "This place isn't for your kind." But the girl was agile and desperate. She dodged the staff with swift movements, running directly toward the table where Edward and Shaw were talking. Her eyes locked onto Edward's with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine, as if she carried an urgent message that couldn't wait. "Mister!" she cried out, using the respectful term homeless children often used for adults who showed them kindness. "Mister, I have to talk to you. It's really important." Shaw frowned, clearly annoyed by the interruption. The waiters approached, determined to remove the girl by force, but Edward held up a hand, signaling for them to wait. The girl approached the table with desperate urgency, her small eyes shining with a mix of fear and resolve that made Edward's heart race. She looked like she had run a long way, her breath coming in ragged gasps and her cheeks flushed from the night's cold. The waiters hesitated, waiting for a signal from Edward on how to handle the unusual situation. "Please, mister," she whispered, completely ignoring the disapproving glares from the restaurant staff. "I need to talk to you. It's about him." Her eyes flickered quickly to Shaw, who was watching the entire scene with growing irritation. A shiver ran down Edward's spine. There was something in the child's expression that awakened all his survival. Instincts, the same ones that had protected him through decades of dangerous business dealings. Without hesitation, he gestured for her to come closer. "What is it, little one?" Edward asked in a low voice, leaning in slightly to hear what she had to say. The girl glanced around nervously, making sure no one else could hear, then moved close to his ear. "Mister," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm, "that man has a gun. I saw him talking to other bad men near my place. They said your name and that they were going to solve the problem tonight." Edward's blood ran cold. Every fiber of his being went on high alert, but he forced himself to maintain a neutral expression, knowing that any reaction could put both him and the girl in even greater danger. Years of tense negotiations had taught him to control his emotions in the most critical situations. Shaw leaned forward, clearly curious about what the child had whispered. "What's this secret conversation?" he asked with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "May I ask what the little lady said?" Edward took a deep breath, knowing his response would determine the course of the next crucial minutes. He needed to protect the girl without raising suspicion about what he had just learned. In a calm, controlled voice, he replied, "She was just asking for a few dollars. I usually help her out when I see her on the streets near my office, but now is not the time." The explanation seemed to satisfy Shaw momentarily, but Edward noticed his shoulders remained tense, and his eyes stayed fixed on the girl with a disturbing intensity. It was as if he were assessing whether she posed a threat to his plans. "I see," Shaw said, but his tone had subtly changed. "Very noble of you to help the needy. I admire men who find time for charity with such busy schedules." The waiters finally intervened, approaching the girl with renewed authority. "Come on, kid. You need to leave now," one of them said, grabbing her arm with more force than necessary. "This establishment has standards to maintain." Edward watched with growing anguish as they escorted the girl toward the exit. She looked back one last time, her eyes conveying a silent message of concern and warning. Even as she was being removed, she was still trying to protect him, and that realization made Edward's chest tighten with a mix of gratitude and terror. "Now, where were we?" Shaw asked, resuming the conversation as if nothing had happened, but Edward noticed he had shifted slightly in his chair and one of his hands had disappeared beneath the table. "We were discussing operating territories," Edward replied, forcing himself to sound natural while his mind worked furiously to process the situation. The girl's warning echoed in his ears like an alarm bell, and with every passing second, his certainty that he was in mortal danger grew stronger. The sounds of the dining room seemed amplified, the clinking of silverware, the distant chatter of other patrons, the soft music playing over the sound system. It all contributed to an atmosphere of normality that violently contrasted with the deadly tension Edward felt growing between them. It was then that he heard the sound that confirmed his worst fears, the unmistakable metallic click of a gun's safety being disengaged under the table made time seem to stand still for Edward. It was a noise he had only ever heard in movies, but now it was terrifyingly real, definitively confirming the girl's desperate words. His muscles tensed instinctively, every fiber of his being preparing for a fight for survival he had never imagined he would face. Shaw maintained the cordial smile on his face, but his eyes had taken on a predatory coldness that made Edward understand he wasn't dealing with a simple corporate representative. This man was a professional, someone trained to kill efficiently and then melt back into the crowd as if nothing had happened. "You know, Edward," Shaw said, his voice taking on a casual tone that was sinisterly at odds with the hidden weapon, "some business disputes just can't be settled at the negotiating table. Sometimes you have to adopt more definitive methods." Edward forced his voice to remain steady, though his heart was pounding like a war drum. "I take it your proposal isn't exactly about dividing market territories." "Oh, but it is," Shaw replied with an icy smile. "You'll be leaving the market. Entirely permanently. Your territories will become ours by default. It's an elegant solution, don't you think?" Edward's mind raced, assessing his options. The restaurant was relatively empty, which meant fewer witnesses, but also fewer people to call for help. The waiters were far off, busy with other customers. His phone was in his jacket's inner pocket, impossible to reach discreetly. The only advantage he had was the element of surprise. Shaw didn't yet know that he had discovered the trap. "Do you work for Atlantic, or is this a personal initiative?" Edward asked, trying to buy time as he planned his next move. "Let's just say that certain powerful interests consider your company an inconvenient obstacle," Shaw replied, subtly adjusting his position. "Nothing personal, you understand, just business. Dirty business, but business nonetheless." Edward realized Shaw was preparing to act. The tension in the air was palpable, like the calm before a devastating storm. He knew he would have only one chance, one moment of opportunity that could mean the difference between life and death. All his experience facing high-pressure business situations had been training for this crucial moment. Without warning, Edward put all his strength into flipping the heavy, solid wood table onto Shaw. The piece of furniture, weighing over 100 pounds, crashed over with a deafening bang, catching the assassin completely off guard. The impact caused Shaw to fire accidentally, the bullet burying itself in the restaurant's ceiling with a crack that echoed through the room. Chaos erupted instantly. The other patrons screamed and dove to the floor, seeking cover behind their own tables. Waiters scattered in a panic, some running toward the emergency exits, others trying to hide behind the bar. The sound of the gunshot had turned the elegant dining room into a war zone. Shaw grunted in pain under the weight of the table, struggling to free himself and regain control of his weapon. Edward used the confusion to run toward the main exit, knowing every second was precious. He could hear Shaw cursing and scrambling to get up behind him. "Stop!" Shaw yelled, his voice echoing through the chaotic restaurant. "You can't run forever, Monroe!" Edward sprinted across the main dining room, dodging overturned chairs and terrified customers. His mind was focused on a single goal: reach his armored car and get out of there alive. But as he neared the entrance, a new concern gripped his heart. Outside, he could hear the sound of someone crying desperately. It was the girl's voice, who had risked everything to save him, and now feared for the fate of the man who had always treated her with kindness. Edward burst through the restaurant's main door and immediately spotted the small figure huddled on the sidewalk. The girl was sitting on the curb, sobbing uncontrollably as she covered her ears with her hands, as if trying to block out the terrible echo of the gunshot she had heard moments before. Her tears glistened under the yellow glow of a streetlight, and her entire small body trembled with fear and despair. Mister! Mister!" she cried out upon seeing him emerge unharmed from the restaurant. She staggered to her feet and ran toward him, throwing herself into his arms with surprising force. For someone so small, I thought they'd hurt you. Edward held her tightly, his heart clenching at the pure display of affection and concern. In that moment, he understood that this child had risked everything to save him, even knowing the dangers she might face. It was an act of courage and loyalty that few adults in his life had ever shown. "I'm okay, little one," he whispered, stroking the girl's disheveled hair. "Thanks to you, I'm alive. You were so brave." But even as he comforted her, his eyes remained fixed on the restaurant entrance, knowing Shaw could appear at any moment. From inside the establishment came sounds of confusion, staff shouting, furniture being dragged, distant sirens suggesting someone had called the police. Edward knew he didn't have much time before the situation grew even more complicated. He had to get out of there immediately, but now he had an additional responsibility to protect the life of the child who had saved his. "Come with me," he said, scooping the girl into his arms without hesitation. "It's not safe here." She clung to his neck, still trembling, but trusting completely in his protection. Edward ran toward where he had left his Mercedes, praying the valet hadn't taken the keys far. Luck was on his side. The young valet, spooked by the gunshot, had abandoned his post and left all the keys on the stand near the parking entrance. Edward quickly located his, unlocked the car, and placed the girl in the passenger seat before starting the engine with trembling hands. "Where are we going, mister?" she asked, wiping her tears with the back of her hand as she stared in wonder at the car's luxurious interior. She had never been inside such an elegant vehicle, and even amidst the danger, her childlike curiosity made her examine every detail. With admiration. "Somewhere safe," Edward replied, shifting into gear and pulling out of the parking lot at a controlled speed. He didn't want to draw unnecessary attention, but he also knew every second was crucial. "What's your name, little one?" "Sophia," she answered shyly. "Sophia Smith, but everyone just calls me Sophia." She paused, looking out the window as they pulled away from the restaurant. "Mister, are those bad men still looking for you?" Before Edward could answer, the rearview mirror revealed the response. Shaw had emerged from the restaurant, visibly injured but still armed. His eyes found the moving Mercedes, and without hesitation, he raised his gun and fired 3 consecutive shots at the vehicle. Sophia screamed and ducked instinctively as she heard the bullets impact the armored body. The metallic thud of the projectiles ricocheting off the bulletproof glass echoed through the car's interior, but the protection held firm. Edward floored the accelerator, the tires screeching on the asphalt. "Oh my God," Sophia whispered, looking back through the rear window. "He's running after us." Shaw had started to chase them on foot, firing again, but the growing distance made his shots increasingly less accurate. Edward swerved sharply around the first corner, putting a building between them and the gunman. Only then did he allow himself to breathe a little easier, but he knew the escape had only just begun. Now they were both targets, and he had to find a way to protect not only his own life, but also that of the brave child who had become his companion on this perilous journey. Edward drove through the city's dark streets, taking random routes to confuse any potential pursuers while his mind worked furiously to process the situation. The armored Mercedes glided silently over the asphalt, but the silence inside the vehicle was heavy with unasked questions and unvoiced fears. Sophia remained huddled in the leather seat, her wide eyes examining every detail of the luxurious interior. She had never imagined that cars with so many buttons, screens, and gleaming finishes existed. For a child who slept under awnings and bridges, this environment represented a completely different, almost magical world. "Sophia," Edward said softly, breaking the tense silence. "I need to understand what you saw. It's very important that you tell me everything, no matter how small the detail." His voice carried urgency, but he tried not to frighten the girl any more than she already was. She took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts with a seriousness that was impressive for someone her age. "I was at my place," she began, referring to the makeshift shelter she had built under a bridge near the financial district. "It's real close to where you work. That's why I always see you pass by." Edward nodded, remembering the many times he had noticed the girl's presence near his office. He always gave her some change or food when he could, touched by the dignity with which she faced her difficult situation. "Yesterday afternoon," Sophia continued, "3 men came to talk near my place. They didn't see me because I was hidden, but I could hear everything. One of them was the man from the restaurant. I recognized his voice when I saw him today." Edward's heart quickened. "What exactly did they say?" "They said your name a bunch of times. Edward Monroe, from Monroe Enterprises," she recited with surprising accuracy. "The man from the restaurant said he had a plan to solve the problem tonight, and that after that there'd be no more competition." A chill ran down Edward's spine. The conspiracy was more elaborate than he had imagined. This wasn't an isolated impulse, but a carefully orchestrated plan to eliminate him permanently. "Did they say anything else?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm as he navigated a dimly lit side street. Sophia hesitated, as if she feared sharing even more frightening information. "They said that if anyone got in the way of the plan, that person would have to disappear too. And one of them asked about witnesses." Her voice dropped even lower. "The man from the restaurant said there wouldn't be any witnesses to worry about." The implication was clear and terrifying. Sophia, by trying to save him, had automatically become a dangerous witness. Now she too was in the crosshairs of the same criminals who wanted him dead. "Mister," she said suddenly, looking out the window with a worried expression, "I think they're following us." Edward glanced at the rearview mirror and felt his stomach sink. A dark sedan had appeared several blocks behind them and was maintaining the same distance, making the same turns. He couldn't be certain, but all his instincts screamed alarm. "Hold on tight," he murmured, gradually accelerating to test his suspicions. The sedan sped up too, keeping the distance constant. There was no longer any doubt. They were being hunted. "Are they going to try and hurt us?" Sophia asked, her small voice, revealing the fear she was trying to hide behind her courage. Edward reached out and gently squeezed her hand. "I won't let anything happen to you, little one. I promise." It was a promise he intended to keep at any cost, even if it meant risking his own life. He needed a plan. Going home was out of the question. It would be too predictable and dangerous. Going to the police was also risky, as he didn't know if the conspiracy included people on the inside. His only option was to disappear temporarily, to find a safe place where they could lie low while he devised a strategy. But first, he had to be sure about his pursuers. Edward made a risky decision. He swerved abruptly right onto a dead-end street, forcing his pursuers to reveal themselves. The dark sedan hesitated for a moment before making the same turn, definitively confirming his suspicions. Now there was no doubt. They were being hunted like animals by professional criminals. "Mister, they're coming," Sophia whispered, gripping the leather seat as she watched the vehicle approach in the side mirror. Her voice trembled, but there was an impressive determination in her small eyes, as if she were preparing to face anything alongside her protector. Edward maneuvered quickly, reversing out of the dead-end street and accelerating in the opposite direction before the sedan could block his path. The tires squealed on the wet asphalt as he navigated the winding neighborhood streets, using his knowledge of the city to try to lose them. For the next 20 minutes, a silent chase unfolded through the empty streets. Edward used every tactic he could think of: sudden changes in direction, running lights at the last second, cutting through narrow alleys where larger cars would struggle. Gradually, he managed to increase the distance between them and their pursuers. When he was finally sure he had lost the sedan, Edward drove to a discreet motel on the outskirts of the city. It was the kind of establishment that didn't ask many questions and accepted cash, perfect for someone who needed to disappear. "We'll stay here tonight," he explained to Sophia as he parked in a dark spot at the back of the motel. "Tomorrow, we'll figure out what to do." He took out his wallet and pulled out a generous amount of cash, knowing credit cards could be tracked. Sophia looked at the simple building with a mix of curiosity and nervousness. "I've never slept in a hotel," she admitted softly. "Is it safe?" "Safer than anywhere else right now," Edward replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. The truth was, he didn't know if any place would be truly safe until he understood the full extent of the conspiracy against him. In the modest but clean room, Edward booted up his personal laptop and began to investigate. He used secure connections and anonymous accounts to access information about Atlantic Corp and its executives. What he discovered in the first few hours of research made his blood run cold. The company wasn't just trying to eliminate him over market competition. Hidden financial documents revealed that Atlantic was involved in a series of illegal activities: money laundering, bribing public officials, fraudulent government contracts. His company had inadvertently uncovered some of these operations during routine audits, making him a much greater threat than he had imagined. "Sophia," he called softly. The girl had fallen asleep in the armchair, wrapped in a motel blanket. She looked so small and vulnerable that Edward felt his chest tighten with a mixture of tenderness and a fierce determination to protect her. But it was then that he discovered the most terrifying piece of information of all. On the dark web forum, he found a recent post offering a substantial reward for information on the whereabouts of Edward Monroe and a girl of approximately 8 years who may be in his company. The post included photos of them both, apparently, taken from the restaurant's security cameras. The reward was high enough to attract criminals from all over the city. They weren't just dealing with Atlantic Corp and its professional hitmen. Now anyone desperate for money could become a threat, turning the entire city into a dangerous minefield. Edward looked at the sleeping Sophia and realized the situation had escalated far beyond his worst fears. This brave child, who had risked everything to save him, now had a price on her head. The hunt had become a matter of life or death for them both, and he knew the next few days would determine whether they would survive. The morning arrived gray and cold, bringing with it the cruel reality that there was no truly safe place in the city. Edward had spent most of the night awake, monitoring social media and forums where the bounty on their heads continued to circulate. With each passing hour, more people became aware of the hunt, and the net seemed to be tightening around them. Sophia woke slowly, stretching in the armchair like a kitten. For a moment, her face reflected confusion about where she was, but soon the memory of the previous night's events returned, bringing with it an expression of concern far too mature for her age. "Good morning, Mr. Monroe," she said softly, noticing the deep circles under his eyes. "You didn't sleep at all, did you?" Edward forced a reassuring smile. "I got some rest. I was just thinking about what we'll do today." The truth was, he had made a decision during the silent hours of the night. He would take Sophia to his mansion, where he would have access to better security and communication resources. Edward's estate was in a high-end gated community with private security and advanced surveillance systems. It was the safest place he could imagine, and there he could devise a more effective plan to deal with the situation. During the drive, Sophia marveled at the changing urban landscape. They went from working-class neighborhoods to increasingly sophisticated residential areas until they finally reached the imposing gate of the community where Edward lived. "You live here?" she asked, her eyes wide at the scale of the houses that stretched beyond the gate. "It's like a castle." "It's my home," Edward replied simply, showing his ID to the guard. "And now it's your home too, for as long as necessary." Edward's mansion was an architectural masterpiece with meticulously manicured gardens, a heated pool, and a panoramic view of the city skyline. Sophia got out of the car in reverent silence, as if she were stepping on sacred ground. "Come," Edward said, guiding her to the main entrance. "I'll show you where you'll be staying, and then we'll talk about how to resolve this whole situation." The housekeeper, Mrs. Carmen, a woman in her 50s who had worked for Edward for over a decade, greeted them at the door. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of the street child beside her employer, but her expression quickly softened with maternal compassion. "Mrs. Carmen," Edward said, "this is Sophia. She'll be staying with us for a while. Please prepare the guest room and arrange for some suitable clothes for her." "Of course, Mr. Monroe," the housekeeper replied, kneeling to be at Sophia's eye level. "What a beautiful child. Are you hungry, dear? I can make you a special breakfast." Sophia looked at Edward for permission before nodding shyly. Mrs. Carmen's genuine kindness reassured her, but she still felt out of place in this environment of unparalleled luxury. Edward settled Sophia into the guest room, an elegant space with a king-size bed, a flat-screen TV, and a private bathroom larger than any space she had ever lived in. He then retreated to his private study to make some important calls. He needed to contact Marcus Riley, the head of his personal security team and a former military man with extensive experience in high-risk situations. If there was anyone he could trust completely, it was Marcus. "Mr. Monroe," Marcus answered, "on the first ring. I've been trying to reach you since last night. I received some troubling intel about a potential threat." "Marcus, I need you at the mansion immediately," Edward said. "We have a critical situation, and bring your trusted team." "I'm on my way, sir. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Edward hung up, feeling slightly more hopeful. With Marcus and his team protecting the property, perhaps they could have some peace to plan their next moves. But he was about to discover that his enemies had anticipated this exact strategy. Marcus Riley arrived at the mansion exactly on time, accompanied by 2 members of his elite team. Edward met them in the study, feeling more relieved than he had in the past 24 hours. He finally had professionals on his side, people trained to handle extreme situations. "Mr. Monroe," said Marcus, a sturdy man of 45 with scars that told stories of combat, "I have intel that there's an active contract on your life. My contacts in the underworld have confirmed the bounty is substantial." Edward recounted all the events of the previous night, from the booby-trapped dinner to the discovery of the dark web post. Marcus listened attentively, occasionally asking specific questions about details that could be important for security. "The kid was brave," Marcus commented after hearing about Sophia's role. "But now she's a target. We'll establish a security perimeter around the property and implement emergency protocols." Over the next few hours, Marcus's team turned the mansion into a makeshift fortress. Additional cameras were installed, motion sensors were configured, and alternative escape routes were established. Edward began to feel genuinely safe for the first time since the incident at the restaurant. Sophia, meanwhile, was experiencing a whole new world. Mrs. Carmen had provided her with suitable clothes, a light blue dress with matching shoes that made her look like a princess compared to The rags she wore on the streets. She took her first bath in a tub with hot water and scented soap, an experience that left her ecstatic. "Mr. Monroe," she said during the elaborate lunch Mrs. Carman had prepared, "is this all real? It's not a dream." Edward smiled, touched by the girl's innocence and gratitude. "It's real, Sophia, and you deserve all of this and more." For a moment he forgot the dangers surrounding them, absorbed in the pure joy of seeing a child experience comfort and security for the first time. The afternoon passed quietly. Sophia explored the mansion with a child's natural curiosity, marveling at each new room. The library particularly fascinated her. She knew how to read, having taught herself by scavenging newspapers and magazines on the streets, but she had never seen so many books in one place. Edward used the calm to do more research on Atlantic Corp, compiling evidence that could be useful to the authorities. He felt optimistic about his chances of resolving the situation through the proper legal channels. It was when the sun began to set that the tranquility was violently shattered. Edward was in his study when he heard Sophia scream desperately from the second floor. The sound froze his blood, and he ran upstairs, followed by Marcus. They found the girl pressed against her bedroom window, staring at the garden in absolute terror. "Mr. Monroe!" she cried, pointing outside. "The bad man is there, the one with the gun from the restaurant." Edward looked out the window and felt his world collapse. Robert Shaw was in the garden, but he wasn't alone. 3 other armed men flanked him, and they were all moving toward the house with the confidence of people who knew the exact location of the cameras and sensors. "How did they get past security?" Edward demanded of Marcus. But the answer came, in the form of a betrayal that cut deeper than any bullet. "Because I let them in," Marcus said calmly, revealing a pistol he had drawn discreetly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Monroe, but their offer was too generous to refuse." Edward looked into the eyes of the man he had trusted with his life and understood that there was no safe place in the world when betrayal came from those closest to you. Sophia clung to his leg, trembling with fear as the net finally closed around them. "You have 5 minutes to say goodbye to the girl," Marcus said coldly. "After that, my job is done, and theirs begins." Edward looked at Sophia, whose small eyes reflected fear, but also a fierce determination that surprised him. Even facing Marcus's betrayal and the imminent arrival of the assassins, the girl was no longer crying. Instead, she held his hand tightly, as if prepared to face anything alongside her protector. "Marcus," Edward said, keeping his voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins, "do you really think they'll let you live after I'm gone? You know too much about their methods." The former soldier hesitated for a fraction of a second, a shadow of doubt crossing his face, but he quickly regained his composure. "They need someone with my expertise for other operations. It's a long-term arrangement." "Mr. Monroe," Sophia whispered, discreetly tugging on his sleeve, "I know a way." Edward bent down slightly, pretending to comfort her while he listened to her almost inaudible words. "Mrs. Carman's room has a secret door behind the closet. She showed it to me earlier, said it was for emergencies." Edward's mind raced. Mrs. Carman had served his family for years and knew all the mansion's secrets, including security modifications he had forgotten about. If Sophia was right, there might be an escape route that Marcus didn't know about. "5 minutes are up," Marcus announced, gesturing with the gun. "Come downstairs. Shaw is waiting in the living room." Edward scooped Sophia into his arms, whispering in her ear, "Trust me and do exactly as I say." She nodded almost imperceptibly, her small arms tightening around his neck. They descended the stairs to the main living room, where Shaw awaited them with a cold smile. His three accomplices were positioned strategically around the room, blocking all obvious exits. Mrs. Carmen sat in an armchair, clearly frightened, but apparently unharmed. "Edward Monroe," Shaw said theatrically, "what a pleasure to see you. Again, I regret that our dinner was so abruptly interrupted." "What do you want?" Edward asked directly. "If it's my company, you can have it. Just let the girl go." Shaw laughed with disdain. "Oh, it's not just about business anymore, my dear fellow. You've seen my face. You know my name. You have evidence that could compromise our entire operation. And the girl—" His eyes fixed on Sophia with a coldness that made Edward shudder. "She's a very inconvenient witness." It was then that Sophia did something completely unexpected. She began to cry loudly, dramatically, as if having a panic attack. "I want to go! I want to go!" she screamed, struggling in Edward's arms with surprising force. "Shut that kid up," Shaw ordered, annoyed by the shrill sound of her cries. Edward pretended to struggle to control her, gradually moving toward Mrs. Carmen. "Sophia, please, calm down," he said loudly, but then whispered softly, "Keep it up, little warrior." In the chaos caused by Sophia's screams, Edward managed to exchange a meaningful look with Mrs. Carmen. The housekeeper, who had raised children and knew them well, understood immediately that this was a performance. Discreetly, she nodded toward the hallway that led to her room. "Enough!" Shaw yelled, losing his patience. "Marcus, finish this!" But Sophia had created the perfect diversion. The moment Marcus raised his gun, Edward dove behind the sofa, pulling Sophia with him. Gunshots echoed through the elegant room, shattering an expensive crystal vase and scarring the fine wood-paneled walls. "Now!" Edward whispered to Sophia, and they both bolted for the hallway as the criminals regrouped for another assault. The little warrior had bought them the precious seconds they needed to escape. Edward and Sophia sprinted down the hallway, hearing the angry shouts and heavy footsteps of the criminals behind them. Mrs. Carmen's room was at the end of the service corridor, an area of the mansion the intruders likely didn't know well. Every second was precious, and Edward could feel Sophia's heart pounding against his chest as he carried her. "This way, mister," she whispered, pointing to the ajar door of the housekeeper's room. They ducked inside, and Edward locked the door behind them, knowing it would only buy them a few moments before the criminals broke it down. The room was simple but cozy, with dark wood furniture and family photos scattered on the surfaces. Sophia ran directly to an old wardrobe in the corner, pushing aside the hanging clothes to reveal a small, disguised door in the back wall. "Mrs. Carmen said your grandfather built this during the war," Sophia explained quickly, opening the secret passage. "He was afraid of invasions and wanted a way to escape." Edward was impressed by the ingenuity of the construction. The passage was narrow but usable, clearly designed for a quick escape in an emergency. Without hesitation, he ducked and entered the dark tunnel, followed closely by Sophia. The passage was a low corridor that forced Edward to move, hunched over, but it was well built and apparently well maintained. Faint emergency lights lit the way, suggesting someone still took care of the old system. "Where does it lead?" Edward asked as they moved quickly through the tunnel. "To a small house on the other side of the wall," Sophia replied, demonstrating the impressive memory she had developed for survival on the streets. "Mrs. Carmen said it's where the gardener used to live." Behind them, they heard the sound of splintering wood as the criminals broke down the bedroom door. Frustrated shouts echoed as they discovered the open wardrobe and the secret passage. "They found it," Sophia whispered, picking up her pace despite her small legs. Edward scooped her up again, running as fast as he could through the narrow tunnel. He could hear distant voices behind them, indicating that Marcus and his henchmen had entered the passage and were in pursuit. Their lead was small, but perhaps it would be enough. The tunnel seemed to stretch on for an eternity. But finally, they saw a sliver of light ahead. Edward pushed open a heavy wooden door, and they emerged into a small, abandoned house, just as Sophia had described. The place was dusty and clearly unoccupied for years, but it offered direct access to a side street outside the gated community. "My car," Edward muttered, realizing the Mercedes was parked on the other side of the property, inaccessible. They needed another mode of transport, and fast. Sophia peered through a dusty window and pointed to the street. "Mister, there's a bus over there." Edward looked and saw a city bus pulling up to a nearby stop. It was perfect. Public transportation where they could blend in with other passengers, much harder to track than a private car. They ran to the stop, just as the bus was about to leave. Edward tossed some coins into the fare box and pulled Sophia to a seat at the back of the vehicle, both of them breathless but relieved to be moving away from the immediate danger. "Where are we going now?" Sophia asked, looking out the window as the mansion disappeared in the distance. Edward wasn't sure. His usual resources, home, office, security contacts, had been compromised. He needed to think like a fugitive, not a CEO, and find allies in places his enemies wouldn't expect. "We're going to a place where no one will look for us," he said finally, an idea beginning to form in his mind. "We're going back to where it all began." Sophia looked at him with curiosity, but trusted his judgment. After all, they had made it this far by working together, and she knew Edward would do anything to protect her. The bus took them back downtown to where it had all started. Edward had a risky plan: to use his knowledge of the local underworld to find unexpected allies. He knew there were people on the streets who hated professional criminals like Shaw and his gang, people who might help them if approached correctly. They got off near the bridge where Sophia used to sleep. It was a place she knew better than anyone, with hiding spots and escape routes that no outsider could easily find. For Edward, it was a completely alien world, but for Sophia, it was familiar territory. "My home is over there," she said, pointing to a makeshift structure under the bridge's pillars. It was made of reinforced cardboard, plastic tarps and scraps of wood, an ingenious shelter that offered protection from the rain and wind. Edward was touched by the dignity with which Sophia had organized her small space. There were carefully stacked books, a few folded clothes, and even wildflowers in an old tin can serving as a vase. It was the home of someone who refused to lose hope, even in the most difficult circumstances. "This is where we plan our next move," Edward said, sitting on a wooden crate that Sophia used as a chair. "Do you know any other street kids who could help us?" Sophia nodded enthusiastically. "There's Leo, Mia, Ricky. They know everything that happens in the city. Nobody pays attention to kids, so we see a lot of stuff." Over the next few hours, Sophia mobilized an informal network of young informants. Street kids appeared from various directions, all curious about the rich mister who was hiding out with Sophia. Edward was impressed by the loyalty and intelligence of these children, who quickly understood the situation and offered to help. "The man in the black suit is looking for you," reported Leo, a 10-year-old boy with sharp eyes. "He's offering money to anyone who says where you are." "But no one's gonna say anything," added Mia, a 9-year-old girl with undone braids. "Sophia always shares her food with us. Now it's our turn to help her." Edward felt a profound emotion at this display of solidarity. Children who had almost nothing were willing to risk everything to protect a friend. It was a lesson in humanity that no business school could ever teach. But as night fell, Sophia made a decision that broke Edward's heart. While he was talking with the other children about escape strategies, she quietly slipped away and wrote a note on a torn piece of paper. "Mr. Monroe," the message read in a childish but firm hand, "you've done so much for me. I don't want you to suffer anymore because of me. I'm going to turn myself in so they'll stop looking for you. Thank you for showing me there are good people in the world. Please be safe and happy. Love, Sophia. When Edward found the note, Sophia had already vanished into the city's darkness. The other children were in a panic, reporting that she had left alone, heading downtown, determined to find Shaw and turn herself in exchange for Edward's safety. "No!" Edward yelled, leaping to his feet in desperation. "She doesn't understand. They'll hurt her even if she surrenders." His voice was thick with anguish, realizing the brave child was walking straight into a deadly trap. Leo grabbed his arm. "Mister, we know where she went. The man in the suit is at the abandoned warehouse near the port. That's where she's going." Edward looked at the worried faces of the children around him and made the most important decision of his life. This was no longer about survival or business. It was about saving a little girl who had become more important to him than his own safety. Edward ran through the city's dark streets with a determination he had never felt, not even in the most critical moments of his business career. Behind him, Leo and the other children followed like a small troop of soldiers, all united by the same goal, to save Sophia before it was too late. The abandoned warehouse in the Port District was a sinister place, with broken windows and graffiti-covered walls. Faint lights filtered through the cracks, indicating activity inside. Edward observed the building from a safe distance, planning his approach. "There are 2 men watching the entrance," whispered Leo, who had crawled closer for reconnaissance. "And there are cars parked out back." Edward knew a direct approach would be suicide. He had to be smarter, use elements his enemies wouldn't expect. It was then that he had a risky idea, but one that might just work. "Kids," he said, gathering the small group, "do you know the police officers who patrol this area?" Mia nodded. "There's Sergeant Davis. He's cool with us, always brings us food when he can." "Perfect," Edward said, pulling out his cell phone. "I'm going to call the police. But first, I need to make sure Sophia is safe." Using the infiltration skills the children had developed to survive on the streets, Edward managed to get closer to the warehouse undetected. Through a broken window, he saw Sophia in the center of the empty space, sitting on a chair with her hands tied. Shaw and 3 other men surrounded her, clearly using her as bait. "Where's your protector, kid?" Shaw asked cruelly. "I thought he'd come running to save you." Sophia held her head high with impressive dignity. "He's not coming. I told you I'd turn myself in if you left him alone." "How touching," Shaw sneered. "But you don't understand how this business works. Witnesses need to disappear, no matter how brave they are." Rage burned in Edward's chest. These criminals were terrorizing an innocent child, and he wouldn't let it continue. He gave a signal to Leo, who ran silently to find Sergeant Davis. 15 minutes later, Edward made the bravest decision of his life. He walked directly toward the warehouse's main entrance, his hands raised in a sign of surrender. "Shaw!" he yelled. "I'm here. Let the girl go and settle this with me." The criminals were surprised by his unexpected appearance. Shaw smiled with perverse satisfaction. "Edward Monroe, how noble of you to show up, though it won't save either of you." "Mr. Monroe, no!" Sophia cried, tears streaming down her face. "I wanted you to be safe." Edward walked into the warehouse, keeping his hands visible. "Let her go, Shaw. Your problem is with me, not a child." "What a moving scene," Shaw said, gesturing for his men to surround Edward. "But you both know too much. It's a shame, really." It was at that moment that Sophia once again showed her extraordinary courage. With a swift move she had learned from living on the streets, she kicked the chair she was sitting on, knocking it into one of the criminals and creating a crucial diversion. "Now, Mr. Monroe," she shouted. Edward dove to the side at the exact moment the sound of police sirens began to echo outside. Sergeant Davis and his team had arrived, alerted by the street kids who knew every hiding spot and shortcut in the area. In the ensuing chaos, with criminals trying to escape and police storming the warehouse, Edward managed to reach Sophia and shield her with his own body. Shaw made a last, desperate move, but was quickly subdued by the officers. "It's over, little warrior," Edward whispered in Sophia's ear as he hugged her tightly. "It's over for good." 2 weeks after that transformative night at the port warehouse, Edward and Sophia were sitting at the same table at the summit at River's Edge, now under new management and completely renovated. The establishment had been transformed into a place that welcomed people from all walks of life, just as Edward had envisioned during the difficult days of their flight. Sophia wore an elegant pink dress. Her hair had grown out and was neatly combed, but her eyes held the same brave determination that had made her his savior. On her small finger, she wore a simple but meaningful ring, the legal symbol of her official adoption by Edward. "Dad," she said, the words still sounding new and precious in her voice, "can I order dessert?" Edward smiled, his heart warming every time he heard that magical word. "Of course, sweetheart. You can have anything you want." The events of the past few weeks had changed their lives in ways neither of them could have imagined. Shaw and his accomplices were in custody, awaiting trial for attempted murder and kidnapping. Marcus had been convicted of conspiracy and aiding and abetting. Atlantic Corp was under investigation by a federal task force, and several of its illegal operations had been exposed. More importantly, Edward had discovered a much greater purpose for his life. Using part of his fortune, he had established the Sophia Initiative, a program dedicated to protecting child witnesses of crimes. The institute offered safe harbor, education, and legal support for vulnerable minors. "Dad," Sophia continued playing, with her napkin, "I have that presentation at school tomorrow about what I want to be when I grow up." "And what are you going to say?" Edward asked, though he already knew the answer. "That I want to be a lawyer," she replied with conviction. "To help other kids like me, who need someone to fight for them, and I want to study hard to be as smart as you." Tears of pride welled up in Edward's eyes. In just a few months, Sophia had adapted completely to school life, demonstrating an exceptional intelligence and a determination that impressed all her teachers. She had remained friends with the street kids who helped them, visiting them regularly and always sharing what she had. "You're already very smart," Edward said, "and brave and kind. I'm sure you'll be an extraordinary lawyer." The waiter brought the dessert, a chocolate cake with strawberries that made Sophia's eyes light up with joy. Edward watched every happy expression on her face, still marveling at how a foretold tragedy had turned into the greatest blessing of his life. "Dad," Sophia said between bites of cake, "remember when you told me that sometimes guardian angels come in unexpected forms?" "And I remember," Edward replied. "I think you were my guardian angel," she said with touching simplicity, "because before I met you, I was just surviving. Now, I'm really living." Edward reached across the table and held Sophia's small hand. "Actually, little one, you were my guardian angel. You taught me that true wealth isn't what we accumulate, but the love we share and the people we protect." They finished their dinner as the sun set over the city, painting the sky in golden hues that reflected off the restaurant's windows. The same place that had once been a scene of terror and violence now symbolized rebirth, hope, and second chances. Walking hand in hand toward the car, Edward looked at Sophia and knew he had found his greatest treasure. A brave girl who risked everything to save a kind stranger, proving that true love knows no social or economic barriers, and that sometimes miracles come in small packages with big eyes and even bigger hearts.